There are moments in American politics when the ground doesn't just shake, it shatters. And what's happening in Minnesota right now, over these past few days, the break has been loud enough to shake Washington to its core, absolutely terrify Ilhan Omar's inner circle, and trigger one of the most aggressive federal responses we've witnessed in years. Stay with me because what I'm about to reveal will shock you. What investigators uncovered wasn't just fraud. It wasn't just corruption. It wasn't even just another welfare scandal. It was something far more sinister, something that should concern every single American. Minnesota taxpayer money, your money, traced directly into the hands of a foreign terrorist organization. And the second President Trump got briefed on this, he didn't hesitate. He didn't stall. He didn't play politics. He ordered what some are calling a direct federal takeover of the situation, including an immediate termination of protected status for nearly 1,000 Somali nationals. And when Ilhan Omar heard it, her reaction told us everything we needed to know. The panic, the denial, the absolute collapse. Today, we're going to break down exactly what happened, why Minnesota is erupting right now, how the fraud was directly tied to terror, and why Trump's response is sending shock waves through the entire political world. So let me walk you through this step by step, because what's unfolding right now isn't just a Minnesota story. This is a turning point for the entire country, and you need to understand what's really happening. You know, when I first heard about this, my initial thought was, how does something this massive stay hidden for so long? How do you have fraud at this scale, with this many people involved, and it doesn't trigger alarms earlier? But then you start looking at the details and you realize this wasn't an accident. This wasn't a few bad actors slipping through the cracks. This was a coordinated network operating in plain sight, exploiting every single loophole they could find. And that's what makes it so deeply alarming. Because when investigators finally connected the dots, they didn't just find stolen welfare dollars. They found a pipeline, an actual system that was funneling American taxpayer money overseas, straight into territories controlled by one of the most dangerous terrorist groups in East Africa. Think about that for a second. Really let it sink in. Programs designed to help hungry kids, seniors who desperately need housing support, families struggling just to make ends meet, all of it getting hijacked and redirected. Not just stolen for personal gain, though there was plenty of that too, but actually flowing into the hands of people who actively want to harm us, who want to destroy America. Now, the scale of what we're talking about here is absolutely staggering. Federal prosecutors have filed charges against somewhere between 70 and 80 individuals so far, and we're not talking about small-time theft here. The total amount involved, well over $250 million. Let that sink in for a moment. $250 million, maybe even more, taken from programs meant to feed children and house vulnerable Americans. And here's the thing that really gets me, that should get every American fired up. This wasn't a sophisticated, high-tech operation. It wasn't hackers breaking into secure databases or masterminds manipulating complex financial instruments. It was simpler than that, almost embarrassingly simple. And in some ways that makes it so much worse because it means the systems we have in place, the safeguards we assume are protecting taxpayer money, they just weren't working. Or maybe, and this is the scary part, maybe they were being deliberately ignored. Let me give you an example of just how brazen this whole operation was. There was one operation they called a safari restaurant that claimed to be serving thousands of meals every single day. We're talking about feeding what would amount to a small army of children, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. But when investigators actually looked at their food expenses, barely a couple $1,000s. Now, I don't know if you've ever tried to feed a large group of people, but I can tell you, you can't feed an army on that kind of budget. You just can't. The math doesn't work. It's impossible. But you know what it can do? It can disguise something else entirely. It can create the appearance of a legitimate operation, while the real money gets channeled somewhere completely different. And that's exactly what was happening here. The operation was acting like a central hub, taking in federal nutrition dollars and then pushing them out through what they called charitable operations. But these weren't charities in any real sense. They were vehicles for moving money, for laundering stolen funds. And once you understand that basic structure, everything else starts to make sense. The impossible numbers, the fake documentation, the shell companies operating out of mailbox addresses. If you're finding this information valuable, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button right now. We're bringing you the truth that mainstream media won't touch, and I need your support to keep doing this work. One of the more recent arrests really drives this home and shows you just how broken the system is. There was an individual who had already been kicked out of a federal assistance program years ago for suspected fraud. Already caught, already flagged, already marked as a problem. And yet somehow, Minnesota officials approved him to receive child nutrition funds again. He went on to wire over $100,000 overseas, paid tens of thousands in kickbacks, and even bought property using stolen funds. How does that happen? How does someone with a documented history of fraud get approved for more federal money? That's the question a lot of Minnesota residents are asking right now, and they're not getting good answers from anyone. Then there's another case that's almost comical in how absurd it is, except it's not funny at all when you think about what it represents. There was a defendant operating out of a small town claiming to serve 6,000 meals a day. 6,000 meals in a town with half that population. Think about the logistics of that for just a second. Even if every single person in that town, every man, woman, child, and infant ate 2 meals from this program every single day, the numbers still wouldn't add up. It's mathematically impossible. But nobody caught it. Or if they did catch it, they didn't act on it. They looked the other way. This isn't fraud in the traditional sense. This is a criminal ecosystem, and it operated for years, growing larger and more brazen with each passing month because the oversight just wasn't there, or worse, because people who should have been watching decided to look the other way for political reasons. But here's where things take an even darker turn, where this story goes from outrageous to terrifying. Because as massive as this welfare fraud was, investigators started noticing something else, something that changed everything. Money wasn't just being stolen and spent on luxury items or property or kickbacks. A significant portion of it was leaving the country entirely, flowing back to Somalia through informal money transfer networks. Now you might think, okay, people sending money back to their home country to support family, that's not inherently criminal, right? And you'd be correct under normal circumstances. Remittances are a normal part of the global economy. Millions of people around the world send money back home to help relatives, and there's nothing wrong with that. But here's the problem, and this is crucial to understand. When you're using informal channels to move money, especially into regions controlled by militant groups, those transactions don't go untaxed. In Somalia, Al-Shabaab, which is linked to Al-Qaeda and designated as a foreign terrorist organization by the United States, controls significant territory. And they fund their operations in part by taxing money that flows through their areas. It's essentially a terror tax. Every single transaction that passes through their informal financial networks gets a cut taken off the top, and that cut goes directly into funding their activities. Activities that include attacks on civilians, destabilizing governments, and yes, targeting Americans and American interests around the world. So when federal counterterrorism officials traced portions of the stolen welfare money through remittance channels into Al-Shabaab-controlled territory, the entire situation changed overnight. It wasn't just fraud anymore. It wasn't just a state-level corruption issue. It was a national security breach of the highest order. And that's what landed on President Trump's desk, not just a report about welfare fraud in Minnesota, but a full intelligence assessment that American taxpayer dollars, money meant to feed hungry children in America, was ending up in the hands of terrorists who want to kill Americans. Now, I don't know about you, but if I were the president and someone put that briefing in front of me, I'd want immediate action. No delays, no committees, no studies. Action. And that's exactly what happened. The response was swift and absolutely decisive. Trump terminated temporary protected status for close to 1,000 Somali nationals living in Minnesota, effective immediately. No grace period, no appeals process, no second chances. Because in his administration, national security comes first every single time, no exceptions. He made his position crystal clear in his public comments, and he didn't mince words. He said, "Somalis have caused a lot of trouble. They're ripping us off for a lot of money. There's a tremendous amount of money going back to Somalia." And his question was simple and direct. Why are we paying money to Somalia? What are we getting in return for this? What benefit is America receiving? He also called out Ilhan Omar directly, saying, "She does nothing but complain about our country and our constitution, and she comes from a country that's devastated and crime-ridden." He said the country is a disgrace, and we took their people in, and we're not taking them anymore. We're getting a lot of them out because they're nothing but trouble. Now, those are strong words, incredibly strong, but they reflect a fundamental shift in how this administration views the situation. It's not about being anti-immigrant or targeting a specific community just because of their ethnicity. It's about accountability. It's about saying, if you come to this country, if we extend our generosity and our systems of support to you, you don't get to abuse that trust. You don't get to steal from us and then act like you're the victim when you get caught. And that's where Ilhan Omar's reaction becomes so incredibly telling, so revealing about who she really is. Because instead of expressing outrage at the fraud, instead of condemning the people who stole hundreds of millions of dollars from programs meant to help children, instead of demanding accountability and transparency and justice, she went on the defensive. Her response was immediate and emotional and completely predictable. She held a press conference and declared that there is not a single piece of evidence that taxpayer money from Minnesota has gone to aid terrorism. She called the investigations racist, xenophobic, and immoral. She said, "We cannot blame the lawlessness of an individual on a whole community." And she framed the entire situation as persecution, as a political attack, as Trump and his supporters lying about and scapegoating the Somali community for political gain. But here's the thing, and this is absolutely critical to understand. Her own political foundation is built on that very community. Her district, her fundraising networks, her supporters, they're deeply embedded in the same Minneapolis Somali population that's now at the center of the largest welfare fraud case in American history. So when indictments start dropping, when arrests start happening, when people start getting convicted and going to prison, every single one of those cases threatens her credibility. Every single one tightens the noose around her political future. She's not defending abstract principles of justice or civil rights here. She's defending her base. She's defending the structure that keeps her in power, that keeps her relevant. And that desperation is showing through more and more. You can see it in her face, hear it in her voice, watch it in her body language. This isn't the confident, progressive firebrand we're used to seeing on television. This is someone who knows the walls are closing in, who can feel the ground shifting beneath her feet. And those walls are closing in fast because Minnesota Republicans have had enough of this. Members of Congress from Minnesota, we're talking about representatives like Tom Emmer, Michelle Fischbach, Brad Finstad, Pete Stauber. They formally demanded that the Department of Justice open a full federal terrorism investigation. They want to know, were Minnesota taxpayers inadvertently funding terrorism, and if so, who knew about it? Who allowed it to happen? Who looked the other way and why? This isn't political theater or partisan grandstanding. This is elected officials from both parties, though mostly Republicans at this point, saying enough is enough. This is a direct threat to America, not just a local corruption issue that can be swept under the rug. And they want answers, real answers, not excuses, not deflections, not lectures about racism and Islamophobia. They want to know how 70+ people got indicted, how $250 million got stolen, and how none of the oversight mechanisms caught it until it became a national embarrassment and a security threat. Meanwhile, the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Justice, and the Treasury Department are now moving in lockstep, coordinating like we haven't seen in years. They've been ordered to dismantle every remittance pipeline that could be feeding terror networks abroad. They're reviewing vetting standards for refugees and asylum seekers from high-risk countries. They're looking at whether remittance networks should be reclassified as monitored financial channels because of this terrorist taxation issue. The days of sending money overseas with no oversight, no questions asked, those are over. This case forced America to wake up from a long sleep. And once you wake up to the reality that your generosity is being exploited, that your systems are being gamed, that your tax dollars are ending up in the hands of people who want to harm you and your family, you can't just go back to sleep. You have to act. You have to protect yourself. And that action is creating a political firestorm in Minnesota because ordinary people, working-class Minnesotans, Democrats, independents, moderates, people who maybe voted for Ilhan Omar in the past because they believed in diversity and inclusion, they're furious now. They're asking how hundreds of millions in child nutrition funds could just vanish while the state looked the other way. They're demanding accountability after learning that their money ended up in Al-Shabaab territory. They want someone to answer for this betrayal. And calls for Omar's resignation are growing louder every single day. Some people are even talking about recall mechanisms, exploring whether there's a legal path to remove her before the next election cycle. This isn't partisan outrage anymore. This is a multiracial working-class rebellion from people who feel robbed, betrayed, and deliberately kept in the dark by their elected officials. You have to understand something about the political landscape in Minneapolis right now to fully grasp what's happening. Omar's district has one of the largest Somali populations in the United States. It's the foundation of her coalition, the bedrock of her political power. Many of the people who helped her get elected, who organized for her, who raised money for her, who knocked on doors for her, they come from that community. And now that same community is at the center of the largest welfare fraud investigation in American history. Every new arrest threatens her credibility. Every new indictment tightens the rope around her political neck because these aren't strangers. These aren't people from across the country or across the state. These are individuals from her own constituency, from her fundraising circles, from the networks that helped put her in Congress. And voters are starting to ask a very uncomfortable question that she doesn't want to answer. What did she know and when did she know it? Now, I'm not saying she was directly involved in the fraud itself, but what people are wondering is how could something this massive be happening in her own backyard, in her own community, among her own supporters, and she had no idea? How could she not see the warning signs? Or if she did see them, and this is the more disturbing possibility, why didn't she speak up? Why didn't she demand investigations? Why didn't she call for accountability before it became a national scandal and a security threat? Those are fair questions that deserve honest answers. And the fact that she's responding with anger and accusations rather than transparency and cooperation, that's not helping her case at all. It's making her look defensive. It's making her look guilty. It's making her look like she's more interested in protecting her political base than in protecting the integrity of federal programs or the safety of American citizens. And here's where things get really interesting from a broader perspective. Because this isn't just about Ilhan Omar anymore. This is about a much bigger ideological battle that's playing out across the entire country right now. It's about identity politics versus national security. It's about tribal loyalty versus American citizenship. It's about whether we prioritize protecting specific ethnic communities or protecting the nation as a whole. Omar's entire worldview is built on what I would call a post-American ideology. And I don't say that lightly or as an insult. It's a belief system that sees America as fundamentally illegitimate, as a country built on exploitation and oppression and colonialism. Under this framework, taking from America isn't theft, it's restitution. It's justice. It's taking back what was stolen through historical injustices. And loyalty doesn't flow to the nation. It flows to your ethnic identity group, to your tribe, to your community of origin, to your religion. That's why she can stand in front of a crowd and say, Somalis are not terrorizing this nation, we are the fabric of America, while simultaneously telling her own community in private settings that she wants to go back to Somalia to raise her children there. Those two statements reveal the fundamental contradiction at the heart of her political identity. She's American when it's convenient, when it serves her political purposes, when it gives her power and influence. But her true allegiance, her real loyalty, lies elsewhere. Now, compare that to Trump's message, which couldn't be more different. His framework is simple and straightforward. America must defend itself. National loyalty is the standard. Terror-linked fraud gets zero tolerance, no exceptions. If you come to this country, you're expected to assimilate, to contribute, to become American, not just in name or on paper, but in spirit and in heart. And if you abuse our generosity, if you exploit our systems, if you send our money to groups that want to harm us, you don't get to stay. You forfeit that privilege. One narrative weakens the country, the other protects it. And polling shows Americans overwhelmingly side with Trump on this issue. Because when taxpayer dollars end up in terror-controlled territory, people don't care about identity politics or diversity or inclusion. They want security. They want accountability. They want their government to put Americans first, to protect American interests. But here's what's really concerning federal investigators right now, what's keeping them up at night. They're warning that Minnesota might just be the tip of the iceberg, that this could be much bigger than anyone realizes. They're finding evidence that similar Somali-linked fraud rings may be operating quietly in other states across the country, exploiting the same loopholes, using the same tactics, following the same playbook. The systems that failed in Minnesota exist in other places too. The same weak oversight, the same loose criteria, the same reluctance to ask hard questions for fear of being called racist or Islamophobic. And that's exactly what these criminal networks count on. They count on people being afraid to enforce the rules. They count on bureaucrats looking the other way to avoid controversy. They count on activists screaming discrimination the moment anyone tries to verify whether programs are being used properly. So now, for the first time in years, federal regulators are openly discussing whether remittance networks should be reclassified as monitored financial channels because of this terrorist taxation issue. Because of the national security implications, the government is considering whether money flowing to certain high-risk countries needs to be tracked and regulated the way we track other financial transactions that could fund terrorism. The days of sending money overseas with no oversight, no questions asked, those days are ending right now. This case forced America to wake up to a reality we've been ignoring for too long. And once you understand that hostile groups are exploiting your generosity, that they're using your own systems against you, you can't just ignore it anymore. You have to close the loopholes. You have to tighten the vetting. You have to protect the homeland. And under this administration, national security is not negotiable. It's not something we compromise on. It's the priority, which means TPS protections for other high-risk countries are now under review. Refugee vetting standards that were relaxed for years under previous administrations are tightening again under President Trump. And states are being put on notice. If you can't manage federal programs responsibly, if you can't prevent fraud at this scale, if you can't protect taxpayer dollars, the federal government will step in and take over. The scandal isn't just reshaping Minnesota politics. It's reshaping the entire national immigration debate because it's proving something that many Americans have suspected for a long time but were afraid to say out loud for fear of being labeled racist. Not everyone who comes here wants to be American. Some people want to exploit America. They want the benefits, the security, the opportunity, but they don't want the responsibility. They don't want the assimilation. They don't want to leave their old loyalties behind and embrace American values. And when that happens, when you import people from countries built on corruption, violence, and tribal conflict, and you don't require them to adapt to American values and American systems, you end up importing those same problems into your own country. You end up with parallel systems, with divided loyalties, with communities that see America as something to be exploited rather than protected and cherished. Now, I want to be very clear about something before we wrap this up, because I know this is sensitive territory and people will try to twist what I'm saying.